Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure, great honour to be here this afternoon. Thank you to Policy Exchange for inviting me, and also my thanks to the Law Society, the City of London, and to Eversheds as well. London, the city, and the competitive global economy. I think the key aim is how we position London and the UK to prosper from what is, in my view, likely to be a significantly positive global economic outlook over the next 10 or 20 years. The countries that will do well in this environment will be those that have at least one of the three C's: the cash, the commodities, or the creativity. The cash in the sense of a financial sector like the City of London, commodities, well, we don't have much of those, probably even less if Scotland votes for independence, and creativity, we have it in spades here in London. The cities that do well in this global environment will be those that adapt and change, those that play to their strengths, as already been mentioned, and those that, in my view, position themselves and understand the changing, growing global economy. It's in this environment I want to focus on London, and I will focus in three aspects. One, the city in relation to the London economy. Second, the issues facing the city from a regional perspective as well as a global perspective. And finally, third, the implications. The city in terms of the London economy. It's easy to forget that if we were here 6 years ago as the financial crisis was hitting hard, people were incredibly pessimistic, not just about the city itself, but about the London economy. By 2011, riots were evident across London. There was a sense of pessimism. And lest we forget as well, in the run-up to the Olympics, there was widespread pessimism about London's ability to host the Olympic Games. Indeed, the BBC, after 2 days of the Olympics, was still downbeat. How quickly things change. Now, the London economy is seen as doing very well. The Olympics were seen as a global success. And in many respects, London has become a global brand, even in the way in which it wasn't a global brand before. It has become a magnet for inward investment. Indeed, the UK is now displacing many other economies. It was below in terms of the scale, in terms of inward investment. And London is seen as the city to which most high-skilled, knowledge-based workers want to migrate to. Yet the financial crisis still lingers on. But even though we call it a financial crisis, I would argue that it's better referred to as a banking crisis. If one looks outside of the banking sectors, as has already been mentioned in terms of law, other parts of the city have done incredibly well. And this afternoon's event is about the business and professional financial services, and many of those have had a good few years. Whichever economy one looks at, whether it's a city or a country, the outcome depends upon the interaction between the fundamentals, policy, and confidence. And the fundamentals of the London economy are, in many respects, very good. The fundamentals of the city are, in many respects, very good. But as I will outline in a second or two, there are some significant challenges that we cannot and should not ignore. Policy has played a very big role in allowing the UK and indeed Western economies, particularly those outside of Europe, to rebound from the financial crisis. Confidence in economic terms is probably the most important thing that we aren't able to predict. When there's a lack of confidence, you know it. When there's a rebound in confidence, it can really propel economies more so than can often be imagined. And there is a recovery in confidence at the moment, which is allowing the London and indeed the UK economy to gather momentum. When I look at the London economy, in some respects it's both a specialised economy and a diversified economy. That oxymoron is sometimes difficult to get a handle on. But when I quote some of the figures, you might understand. The financial sector, or financial and insurance sector, the city in many respects, is 19.8% of the London economy. Yet it only accounts, I say only, it accounts for 7.5% of the London economy's employment. So it punches above its weight in economic terms relative to employment. The city across the UK, if you think of the financial sector across the whole UK, accounts for 2 million employment across the UK. And indeed, in many parts of the country, after the National Health Service or the public sector, it is the financial sector that is the dominant part of particular economies. Bournemouth is one example, where Chase, JP Morgan Chase, is the second biggest employer. Leeds is another example. Indeed, the city is more than just the square mile. After the city here in London being 1/5 of the London economy, professional, scientific and technical services are 11.7%. Information and communications, 11.6%. Real estate, bizarrely, 9.8%, although it only accounts for a fraction of employment here in London. Retail trade and wholesale trade, 8.3%, and the list goes on. In many respects, I would argue that if you added up all the different bits of culture and the creative industries, they probably rival the scientific sector as the second biggest part of the London economy. So the creative industries have done well in recent years. Tech City around Shoreditch has grown despite the lack of any pre-planning. And it shows that when you have an enabling environment where you attract skilled workers, different parts of the economy can grow in a way in which economists or indeed policymakers never expected. London is the 9th biggest economy in Europe. And if you look at it in terms of where people come to, it's now the 4th biggest, London is the 4th biggest French city in the world. Last year, London grew by 3.4%. This year is growing by 3.8%. Next year, it's likely to gather even more momentum, although if interest rates do start to rise, that will probably start to take some of the heat out of the economy here. But just to conclude the first part, the London economy is a very diversified economy, but also at the same time, it's a very specialised economy, and playing a key part in the London economy is the City of London. But when we look at the city, it's important to say it's not just the banking sector, it's a whole host of business, professional, legal and financial services. And many of those have helped lead the UK economy out of recession, and many of those are helping the UK economy to gather momentum. That leads on to the second part, how should we look at the city now and in the future? And I'd like to look at that in terms of a global perspective, a regional perspective, and a domestic agenda as well. The world economy is changing, and it is growing. Here in the West, we tend to still think that the whole world has languished in the wake of the financial crisis. I just wrote a book called The Consolations of Economics, but one of the figures I like to quote in the book was 32, 62, 72. $32 trillion was the size of the world economy at the beginning of this century. $62 trillion was the size of the world economy the evening that Lehman Brothers went bust. At the beginning of last year, when I started to write the book, the world economy was $72 trillion. Indeed, now it's probably $74 trillion. Despite the biggest financial crisis in 80 years, the world economy, in nominal terms, but the bulk of this increase was real economic activity. Despite the biggest financial crisis in 80 years, the world economy has continued to grow. And in many respects, that's because the emerging economies have continued to basically come into the global economy. Of course, those emerging economies have a cycle as well. For them, it's not a straight line path up. But it's important for us in the West, and in particular in the UK and London, to make sure that we position ourselves to benefit from this changing global economy. But also at the same time for the city to recognise that a changing global economy results in increased competition as well. Many politicians, many policymakers will point out that employment in the city didn't really fall in the wake of the financial crisis. But many people in financial firms across the city will point out that many new businesses that might previously have grown up here in London have started in other financial centres across the globe, in particular in Singapore, to a lesser extent Hong Kong, one or two in Dubai. We are very much in the global competition as far as the financial sector is concerned. Germany has been the European economy that has positioned itself best at the moment to benefit from the global infrastructure boom that's taking place across Africa and across large parts of Asia. But I would argue, and many others will probably do so as well, that at the next stage of development in China, India, etc., when people have more income, when aspirations change, it's business and financial services that will start to play a bigger role in most of those economies. London, if it plays its cards right, will be well positioned in the same way in which Germany is well positioned now. New trade corridors are being seen across the globe. That's increased flows of goods, commodities, remittances, portfolio and direct investment between economies that we previously would have referred to as the South, South-South trade. In the past, London has always been seen as the centre, not just of many Western economies in terms of when they want to invest across the globe, but it's always been seen, shall we say, as the centre of the BRICS. It's important that we retain that added advantage, and as new trade corridors continue to grow, London needs to make sure that it plays to its competitive strength. And indeed, in the last few years, there's been evidence that London has, despite the crisis, positioned itself well. The Chancellor has played a key role in making sure that London has been one of the major offshore centres for the RMB. After Hong Kong, and you could argue Hong Kong naturally will always be the main offshore centre, you call it that, for the Chinese currency, the RMB, London is the second to Hong Kong. Last year, when the Prime Minister went to China, there was a whole session about the Shanghai Free Trade Zone. London and the UK is playing a key role in helping China develop the free trade zone in Shanghai. Many people aren't quite sure what path this will take, but if the best case scenario materialises, then just as free trade zones in economic terms 20 to 25 years ago had a big impact on the Chinese economy, the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, if it's now copied elsewhere in China, would have a major impact as well. And the UK, including London, looks well placed if it does. And to conclude the part on the global aspect, cities are now playing a bigger role in economic terms. Currently, the top 600 cities in the world account for half of global growth. According to McKinsey's, in the next 20 years, the top 600 cities will account for 2/3 of global growth. Indeed, here in the UK, there's every evidence that younger people are increasingly wanting to migrate to cities, stay in cities, live in even smaller sized accommodation in cities, but they want to be in cities. Indeed, if cities start to play that bigger role, then London clearly will be a major force. But also, according to McKinsey's, of the current top 100, 600 cities in the world, 157 are from the West. In 20 years' time, only 20 are seen as being from the West, London being the only one in the UK. What we need to make sure in the UK is both that London retains its competitive advantage, but also at the same time we see other cities in the UK start to make it into that top 600. That comes in onto the other key issue after global, the regional perspective. I'm not going to talk about Scottish independence, but the regional perspective for London has two aspects. It's the domestic regional perspective and the regional perspective with Europe. The UK often talks continuously, it seems to me, often talks about the north-south divide. And sometimes that means that we get diverted from the need to make sure that London competes and that cities outside London address their opportunities and address their challenges. David Smith in the Sunday Times a few months ago talked about the need for cities outside of London to invest, to innovate, and to boost their infrastructure. But it's important to stress that many of the issues that come to the fore in terms of the north-south divide aren't really part of the north-south divide debate only. They're also very evident in London itself. 1 in 5 people in London earn less than the living wage. 5 of the poorest boroughs in the country are in London. So the issues are very apparent here: poverty, inequality, and the need to make sure that there is growth across the board, not just in high-skilled jobs here in the city and in the square mile. But London is helping other parts of the country as well. Last year, the European Commission did an interesting analysis on the most competitive regions in Europe. 3 of the top 5 are here in the United Kingdom, indeed all in the south. In 5th place, the 5th most competitive region in Europe, according to the European Commission, is Surrey and Sussex. The 3rd most competitive region, according to the European Commission in Europe, is Buckinghamshire, Berkshire and Oxfordshire. We often don't talk about those regions. And in 2nd place was London. The most competitive region, just for the record, is Utrecht. But London has a role to play, and it has a regional role as well. But probably for the City of London, it's the other regional aspect, London and the UK versus Europe. That's the big issue. Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, since I've been working with him at the beginning of last year, has carried out a number of strategic reports. 2 last year were focused on key issues facing London. One was the 2020 report, focusing on London's positioning over the next few years, including the need to generate more jobs, including the need to generate more housing. Also last year was the independent cross-party London Finance Commission, which talked about the need to devolve more powers to regions in the UK, not just London. And indeed London is working with other core cities across the UK to try and at least fulfil some aspects of that. This year, 2 of the strategic reports that the Mayor has carried out include one, an infrastructure growth plan, and indeed he's asked for feedback on this over the next few months. And the other aspect was the Europe report, which I released a few weeks ago. As we moved through last year, it became clear that more and more investors were positive about London, but were very concerned about Europe, both about the lack of growth in Europe now, and also about what would happen if there was a referendum in the UK about the European issue. In terms of this Europe report, I looked at the whole issue from the perspective of the London economy, and in particular what it meant for the city. We asked Volterra, an independent consultant, to carry out a long-term forecast. What's often interesting about the debate in Europe is that business is very negative about the whole idea of leaving, quite rightly too. Because if the UK was to leave the European Union, it would have a significant disruptive impact, particularly in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Legally, it's very complex. Also, business dislikes uncertainty. Ahead of a referendum is likely to be uncertainty. Clearly, if the British people voted to leave, there would be uncertainty as well. Therefore, I thought it was important to have an economic forecast over a much longer time period. We chose a 20-year time frame, and we asked Volterra to carry out some independent analysis. What was interesting was that the best economic scenario was, maybe no surprise, for Britain to remain in a reformed European Union. But more interesting, perhaps, was that if the UK left, and left on good terms, and pursued sensible economic policies, that would be a better economic scenario than staying in an unreformed EU. Of course, the worst case scenario by a long way was to leave, and to leave on bad terms. So the balance of risks from leaving is quite significant. It could turn out really good, or indeed could turn out very poorly. But at the same time, being in an unreformed EU didn't really achieve an optimal outcome. What it showed to me was that the whole debate about the European Union shouldn't just be about in or out. It's about the policies that you pursue if you're in, and the policies you clearly pursue if you were to leave. Also, it showed to me, when we did the detailed analysis, and the report is over 100 pages and there's about 400 or 500 pages in the appendices. When you look at it from different sectors of the London economy, you get a very different perspective. The sector that is most exposed if we were to leave, or indeed the sector that could gain the least from an unreformed EU in the sense of relative to its potential, is the city. Therefore, maybe the city has the most to gain from pushing for a reformed agenda within the European Union. The cost to the city of leaving was high. The value of the seat at the table being lost was high. But interestingly enough, in our analysis, the regulatory gains from leaving were pretty neutral for the city. In terms of London, we felt that to push the reform agenda, the UK would need to really play an engaged role. And even if the UK remained in the EU, which we think it should, the relationship between the Eurozone and the non-Eurozone countries was made to us, or was cited to us by many people across the city as probably as an important an issue in the next few years as to whether there is a referendum or not. The fear was that the desire for many countries on the continent to shore up the European project would mean that the relationship between the Eurozone and the non-Eurozone could become more fractious. And therefore, it's important from a city's perspective, according to many of the people we spoke to make sure that that relationship is as robust as possible. At the same time, another key area to push for reform in is in the single market, in terms of people, services, and to prevent regulatory intrusion. 1 in 4 people in the construction sector in London is a European from outside the UK. 1 in 4 people, no surprise if you go to Starbucks, etc., 1 in 4 people in the accommodation and food sector in London is a European from outside the UK. But at the same time, 1 in 8 people in finance and insurance is a European from outside the UK. So the free movement of people is important. Also, the free movement of services was seen by many people as a big upside potential. And despite the fact that the European Union has continued to say that it will open up financial services and open up the single market in services, there is still a lot more upside potential. So the relationship between the UK and Europe is naturally very important. Yet at the same time, one of the important things that came out of the report was that many of the factors that international investors see as an advantage of London, or in reason to invest here, are factors that are likely to be independent of whether the UK stays in the EU or not. Some of these were cited: the London vibe, the English language, the acceptance of different nationalities, safety, the sheer energy, innovation. I called it the 5 C's at the end: culture, conversation, cosmopolitan, low crime, and creativity. But overall, the key thing is to try and make sure, particularly from a city's perspective, that we stay in a reformed EU and that we do try and help the European Union to reform itself in what is likely to be a changing and growing global economy. That comes on to the third and final part, the implications. There are many domestic implications, and there are many domestic issues as well. Over the last 18 months, it's interesting to observe how the key worry for people in the city has changed. 18 months ago, January 2013, when I started at City Hall, the #1 issue cited was visas. Visas is still an important issue, but in some respects it's now been addressed, although a lot more could be done. As we moved through last year, Europe became the key issue. And indeed, it still is an issue for many different parts of the city. It's now been displaced, though, as the #1 concern by the cost of living and by housing in particular. The cost of living, in many respects, should not be a surprise. When we look at the UK economy, in previous cycles, when the UK and when the US went into recession, it tended to coincide with fall in food, fall in commodity prices. And therefore, often in the past, when Britain had a downturn, the pound weakened, either directly because of policy or indirectly because international investors moved their money elsewhere. When we went into this recession, the pound also weakened. But this time, food and commodity prices did not weaken. China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, other economies had strong demand. So that really started to see a big potential inflation problem. On top of that, a big difference to this cycle, not just in London but across the UK, was the way in which the shock absorber was not unemployment, as economists expected 6 years ago. Economists expected unemployment to rise significantly. This time the shock absorber was wages. More firms held on to staff. Indeed, in London, employment is at a record high, and indeed that's true across the whole UK. There are, however, many people on part-time contracts, many people on 0-hour contracts. So it's not a particularly rosy environment for everyone. But the combination of wages taking the squeeze and high imported inflationary pressures has meant a big cost of living crisis for many people. Now it seems that we're coming to the end of that as wages start to rise. But on top of that, here in London, the additional challenge has been the rise in the cost of housing. And it has to be said, this is a problem that needs many years, perhaps even decades, to address. This year, the good news is that London is seeing the construction of more private homes and more social housing than any year since the early 80s. The challenge, though, is that the stock, in terms of what needs to be addressed, is a challenge, because we've almost had 3 or 4 decades of not really building enough in London. And at the same time, the population of London is now rising quite significantly. It's rising by 100,000 a year. So the combination of those factors means that there is an acute problem in terms of the housing sector. This is a big issue at City Hall, and it's a big focus. But you can't just address the issue from City Hall. In the 1930s and in the 1960s, London did see large-scale housing built on a large scale by the private sector. And that would be the ideal situation we'd like to see in the future. So the challenges have moved on. These are Europe cost of living. But where do we go from here? I would say the main issue, really, in my mind, can be encapsulated in terms of implications under the word infrastructure. Hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, and institutional infrastructure. Hard infrastructure covers many areas. You could argue housing, and you certainly would include transport and airports. This morning, the Davis Commission reported in terms of where the next runway, in their view, should be. Boris Johnson and the City Hall has come out with a reply. But really, the view from City Hall is that we don't just need another runway, we do need a four-runway new airport. And that's an issue that needs to be addressed. But whatever your point of view on this, it's remarkable, even if you did go ahead with another runway at Heathrow, the earliest it's likely to be built would be the tail end of next decade. We don't do infrastructure really well here in the UK, or if we do it well, we don't do the longer term thinking sufficiently well. Indeed, you could argue that if you go to Westminster, we have a whole host of good reports from the Commons and from the Lords, but they don't always get executed. So infrastructure is a big issue. Soft infrastructure, this is where we have much to be proud of. Skills and education. But when we look at the City of London, we're looking at the top end of skills and education. The UK economy still faces a challenge across the board, as indeed do many cities and countries in Western Europe, in terms of skills and education at the bottom end as well as at the top end. But earlier this year, Deloitte, the consultancy, produced an interesting analysis of where are the most high-skilled, knowledge-based jobs in the world. In fifth place was Boston with 425,000. In fourth place was Hong Kong with 630,000. Third place was LA with 784,000. Second place was New York with 1.2 million. First place was London with 1.5 million. So London is very much seen as the magnet in terms of high-skilled jobs. City UK, which carries out very good analysis on the city, takes this one step further and looks at this from the perspective of financial centres. And to quote City UK, within Europe, there are strong national financial centres in Amsterdam, Edinburgh, Frankfurt and Paris. There are strong niche financial centres in Geneva and Zurich. Strong offshore financial centres in Dublin, Guernsey, Jersey and Luxembourg. Emerging centres in Istanbul and Moscow, although whether people still say Moscow now remains to be seen. But the point is that none rival London in terms of its global appeal and global perspective. Therefore, we need to make sure we don't score any own goals. Some might say the relationship with Europe is important there. But at the same time, we need to recognise the increased future competition from other parts of the world. Hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, and finally, institutional infrastructure. The thing I think we really have going for us in the UK on the positive is our institutional framework. We take it often for granted. Not just the new powers we're giving to the Bank of England, but as was mentioned at the beginning, the Law Society, the importance of law here in the UK, and the fact that we've actually created an institutional framework that others really don't necessarily have in many of the emerging parts of the world. I would argue that the financial crisis provided an Apollo 13 moment for London. In the film and documentary of Apollo 13, someone goes up to Gene Kranz, head of mission control, and says, "Gene, this is NASA's worst moment." And he says, on the contrary, if we get the 3 astronauts back to Earth safely, it will be NASA's best moment. And so it proved. I would argue that from a city's perspective, from the financial perspective, that if we do fully and truly learn the lessons of the financial crisis, then I do think that this will be an Apollo 13 moment for the City of London. And it would help position not just the city within Europe, but within the changing global economy. So to conclude, when one looks at the city, I think we need to do it first and recognise its importance in terms of the London economy. Second, when we look at the issues, they're global and they're regional. And third, from the implications, I would say infrastructure, hard, soft, and institutional infrastructure are the key things we need to play to. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sam Fleming. I'm the financial policy correspondent of the Financial Times. I have the pleasure of hosting the panel sessions this afternoon, the various debates we have with some excellent panelists. I'd like to kick things off by taking some questions from you for Gerard Lyons before he leaves us. I might start, Gerard, if that's all right, with a couple of questions of my own. Your Europe report, which you referred to in your opening remarks, obviously garnered an awful lot of media coverage, including on the cover of the Sunday Times. The gist of the coverage was that leaving Europe could be a second best to the scenario of staying in Europe if that departure was got right. I think you referred to that in your comments. It's a question of leaving on good terms, I think you put it. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what leaving on good terms would look like, i.e. what are the preconditions which the UK would need to fulfil in order to leave the European Union without doing significant damage to the economy and also the city?
Yeah, thank you. Well, in terms of the Europe report, I called it a win-win situation. A win-win because I thought that the implications were that if London and the UK were to remain in and help reform the EU, that would be a win. But interestingly enough, if the UK left, then if it pursued sensible policies, and as Sam's just asked me, had a relatively good relationship with Europe, then it also would be a win situation. The reason why it would be a win outside would be very much about positioning London in a global context and recognising the fact that Europe's share of the global economy is shrinking. But in terms of your question specifically, what really came out when we spoke to people on the continent as well as here in the city was that while everyone would like, it seems, maybe one or two people in the EZ area, London to remain within the European Union, there was no other major financial centre, it was felt, that would rival London within Europe. The good terms would be access for the UK to European markets, the access for European goods to the UK markets. We have a big trade deficit with the continent. 4 million jobs, it was pointed out to us, on the continent depended on selling goods to the UK. It was seen that very few would benefit, even though people would want us to stay in, but very few would benefit in economic terms from us leaving. Of course, if we left on bad terms, the phrase used to me was that it would show Europe was becoming more like a prison than a castle, and yet you might want to be outside rather than inside. But I think you can have a constructive debate, but it would very much, I would argue, be better for the UK to have a constructive debate by staying in the EU. But if we were to leave, then it's about having access to each other's markets. The other point to really stress is the global perspective about the fact that we need to make sure that business financial services position themselves globally. And to reiterate the point I made in my talk, there was as much a concern in the city amongst people I spoke to about staying in the EU, that if the Eurozone started to put up more barriers between themselves and the non-Eurozone. And maybe that's the most important thing we need to focus our agenda on in the near term.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take some questions from the audience now. Already one hand has gone up. Yes, thank you. Please, if you could say who you are and where you're from before asking Gerard a question.
My name is John Flood. I'm technically from University College Dublin, but I happen to live in one of the 5 poorest boroughs that got mentioned during the talk, very close to Silicon Roundabout, actually. And I wanted to sort of just draw on something you said. You said London isn't very good at doing, well, UK isn't doing very good at doing infrastructure, nor are we building any decent housing. And if you look at somewhere like Silicon Roundabout, it's got some of the worst broadband provision in the country, apparently. So what is this going to mean? You've given all these wonderful statistics about how great London is in terms of world records and league tables and so forth. Yet it seems to be that at this other end, you are going to kill your golden goose, if you like, sorry to use a cliche, but also how are you going to keep people in London? How are you going to maintain not only your workforce, but also a support workforce, if you like, which probably can't afford a lot of the London prices at the moment.
Let me take two more questions, and then we'll bring them back to Gerald. There's one here at the front, please.
Yes, if I may take up Gerard's remarks on Europe, given the concern which, sorry, I should explain, Gerard Lyons, GHIL. Given the concern which sectors of business in London have expressed about the prospect of leaving the EU, although there are, of course, other views, might it be in the interest of London business to consider the possibility of pressing for foreign mediation, for third-party mediation in this dispute through an institution such as the G7, to make clear to public opinion, which seems to be rather taken with populist enthusiasms at the moment, that if it were to discard its European alliances, its other alliances might not survive unscathed either. In short, get real immigrants.
Thanks. And one more question, please.
Philip Virgo, Digital Policy Alliance. You mentioned hard infrastructure, and I'd like to include in that telecommunications. Wood Street Exchange, which serves the building we're in, does not provide either fibre to the cabinet or fibre to the premises unless you can pay $8,000 a year for a leased line. Same applies for the other 5 exchanges around us. We actually have a business broadband crisis in the heart of the city, let alone other great tranches of London. Should this be one of our priorities?
Okay, thanks very much. Gerard, maybe take the first and the third. They're both infrastructure related, and then the middle.
Yeah, thank you. The question from John from UCD linked many different issues. Transport is really the key issue in terms of the answer to your question. In fact, improved transport, which is one of the areas that's directly under the responsibility of the Mayor, Boris Johnson, transport has been seen as a key factor in terms of allowing different regions of the London economy to prosper, and has been seen as a key part of in terms of urban regeneration. Canary Wharf, around the whole Olympic Village, Stratford, indeed Barking. And one of the key aspects is to have greater transport connections, not just from the outside to the centre, but across all the different outer boroughs as well. And indeed, it's now much easier to go from one outer region of London to another outer region of London. Also, it's very much about improved transport facilities going east. I think the last new Thames crossing to the east was built over 100 years or so ago. The idea is to have, well, there are plans to have many more Thames crossings, 5 has been mentioned. So transport is a key part to address these issues, and it basically allows new jobs to be created, new regions, new parts of London to do well. And I think that that's the key part. The last question from Philip about hard infrastructure. If we spoke on hard infrastructure, we could identify many challenges. And the important thing is that these challenges are now on the agenda, are being talked about. Energy is often mentioned. Broadband, I completely agree, so too does Boris. There are plans afoot where City Hall can contribute, but it's also about the private sector as well as the public sector. It's about enabling the private sector to do more. And I've heard the head of BT talk about what they're doing in this area. So I would agree that this is an area, I'm not an expert on it, but I would say that it's already on the agenda and there's probably a lot more that can be done. The second question from Jeremy about getting the G7 in. Look, I often think that Britain's biggest export is its pessimism. We are always far too pessimistic. Britain is a part of the United Nations Security Council. Britain is a key player in the G7. Britain is the 6th biggest economy in the world. You could say 5th biggest economy, depending on currencies. I would argue that within Europe, if you take a 30-year view, Britain is likely to displace Germany as the biggest economy in Europe, certainly in population terms over a 40-year period. And if we make any inroads into our productivity gap, then the combination of that increased population and increased productivity will allow Britain to become the biggest economy in Western Europe. All of these factors suggest that I don't think we need to get other people in to do our policy agenda for us, but clearly we need to be working with our colleagues, our competitors in some fields, on these issues. Competitors facing global challenges, but I certainly think that Britain needs to be working with our others. But when you say get real, basically it's Western Europe that has the economic problem at the moment. It's Western Europe that has high rates of youth unemployment. If you go to Spain, 1 in 2 people is unemployed. Britain still has a big youth unemployment problem. Thankfully, it's now improving. But up to a year ago, we had 1 million people under 25 who were NEETs, not in employment, educational training. I think that's now down 250,000. But we still have big, significant structural challenges. So we share some of continental Europe's economic problems. But in terms of the future relationship, I do think we need to have a sensible relationship with Europe, as I say, ideally within a reformed EU. But I don't think we need to get the G7 in to mediate. I think we need to work it out ourselves with our European partners. Thank you.
Well, despite our reputation for exporting pessimism, thanks very much for a very optimistic end to the first session. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have our next panel shortly, but first would you join me in thanking Dr. Gerard Lyons.